Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody that has joined this webinar. Truly a global webinar because we have people from all time zones joining in. And today I'm happy to welcome Dr. Vyas, who is a distinguished speaker. He's been on our webinar before, and we'd like to bring him back on to talk about the post-COVID world or post-pandemic world, as we call it. Many of you may have different questions. Dr. Vyas has been a proponent of what is called decoupling, right? And is decoupling the same as deglobalization, right? And is China going to be marginalized, or is China going to be still going to be a major player? And how are other countries offering themselves up in terms of being an alternate to China? For example, Vietnam, Myanmar, Philippines, India, all of them are in this race to offer themselves up as an alternative. And what is going to be US policy towards China? I think we cannot have a better person than Dr. Vyas here to answer a lot of these questions. He is a very well-known, renowned person, and he's been the executive director and co-founder for the Center of Global Supply Chain Management Studies at USC Marshall. Every one of you must be familiar with USC. He's not only been an educator, he's also been in industry himself. In his prior life, he has been in the industry. He's managed supply chains. He's done a lot of things. So he's not just an educator and academician, but also a practitioner. He's a true supply chain practitioner. He's been given many awards, and one of the most distinct things I can say is that he's a member of the US Department of Commerce Advisory Committee for Supply Chain Competitiveness. Right. So with that, I will start this off. We were looking at how to conduct this session, and instead of conducting it as a single presentation by Dr. Vyas, we thought it would be good to have it as more a conversational style. So we will start it off as a conversational style. We will move it to a more presentation style, and then we'll end up with question and answers. Dr. Vyas said that I don't want to have a pre-read of the questions. I don't want to know the questions. I really want to answer them as I think it should be. So I think that's a great thing. So what you're getting here is basically unfiltered Dr. Vyas. Dr. Vyas, if you want to say hello to the audience, we can put our chat.
Arun, thanks for having me, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. And I look forward to taking you through next hour or so about understanding what is the supply chain, what is the state of the supply chain post-COVID. And one of the biggest hypotheses that I have sort of articulated over the last 12 months, but it actually goes back even before the previous administration, about this whole linear single string supply chain that we've been so addicted to it over the last 25, 30 years, and how that is going to change. And obviously the COVID has been the catalyst for that change. So I'm looking forward to having some conversation on my views on decoupling and not the deglobalization.
Thank you. So during our webinar last May, that was in May, and we were just into the pandemic, and there were a couple of predictions you made, and I think one of them is really prophetic. You said that anybody that has a very digital supply chain stands to actually gain disproportionately, or they will be rewarded disproportionately, is kind of what you basically mentioned. And all of us can agree with all the memes and the jokes going around about how Amazon can deliver the vaccine to every doorstep, literally. I think that has come very true. Amazon has been one of those companies that was very digitized, I think, from day one, and it has actually shown that it is being rewarded very well. So thank you for that prophecy. And Yeah, go ahead, please.
No, thank you, Arun. And I just to elaborate on that point, and we'll actually get into the in-depth conversation on this issue. I think this is even more so as we peek out to the lenses of post-pandemic. I think that statement will even further hold truth about how we see the organization, the enterprise, in terms of their ability to not only create what I call the decoupled logistics node, but also create the digital platform along with it to become successful. And I think that's a theme that you'll continue to hear over the next 45, 50 minutes, what I'm going to talk about.
Yeah. And of course, the post-COVID world has changed all our lives. As you can see, I'm in my home office, not in my office, and so are you, right? And but there was a couple of other points you made last time, and one was that as this COVID goes away, there is going to be a lingering effect of the COVID, right? I mean, it is not going to just vanish as some people thought, and it is basically going to continue on, and that life has to be changed, and people have to digitize, and people have to change it. The other thing you talked about was about how the things like aerospace have already shown a legacy for decoupled supply chains, which you're a huge proponent of. And we will talk about that in a few minutes. We'll present about it in a few minutes. But I think you basically are a huge proponent of the decoupled supply chain, and you talked about legacy. And I think we are seeing more and more of it. Yesterday, when I saw Catalent saying was approved for producing the Johnson & Johnson, first thing that jumped to my mind was Dr. Vyas predicted this a long time ago. So yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. So, so with that, why don't we jump into some of the topics of the supply chain? So I will start off with a couple of housekeeping items. We are NexInfo. We are hosting this webinar today. And in summary, we have been in this industry for 21 years now. And I'm myself a supply chain practitioner. And so NexInfo has also been on the forefront of digitizing and improving supply chains. We've done that for many companies, named companies like anybody like Motorola, Toshiba, and then in the pharma industry like Gilead Sciences, Biogen, to name a few. And we've done that also transformation for a lot of the small and medium businesses. And we are located here in the United States primarily, but again, we are trying to become more global. We have some presence in Europe, specifically Switzerland, Ireland, and Netherlands. And then we, of course, also have centers in India that support our global operations. And with that, I will actually move over to the next slide, which would basically, I'm Arun Kavle, and of course, we have Dr. Vyas here with us. And I also went over quickly on his bio in a very informal manner. And as you can see, he has a lot of contributions across many different organizations. He's been recognized by Apex, and he has been contributing to many news channels and different industry organizations. So this is another housekeeping item. For those of you who want to ask any questions, on your screen in that GoToWebinar, you have a Q&A section. Go ahead and enter your questions. We will try and address some of them as we go along if they are topical, but if they're not topical, we'll push them to the end, right? So I do not want to interrupt the flow of Dr. Vyas completely. With that, over to you, Dr. Vyas. Why don't you start?
Yeah, so I think let's establish the baseline, right? So if we just think through the lenses of before COVID, right, what we had witnessed, and this was percolating for almost 15 to 20 years, that the trade deficit was always the discussions that we had. It was the discussions every year we published the trade data, except 1 year in 25 years, we always had trade deficit. And we sort of become desensitized. And I'm talking about we meaning from the US standpoint. But then 2015 and 16, specifically under the previous administration, the trade tensions became huge, right? It became sort of an epicenter of the conversation and the policy. So that, while this was brewing up on our horizon, China was also internally facing the biggest headwinds for the manufacturing. So if you think about China over the last 30 years, become the global manufacturing hub. They became the global factory for the entire world. But they were also facing headwind in terms of the increased labor cost, increased regulatory compliances, increased awareness of the sustainability. And China also realized that their aspiration was no longer just being the world's global manufacturing hub. They wanted to divest and create the service and knowledge economy along the way. So it was a three-pronged approach that China had thought about it. One, creating a consumption-based economy because they produced the largest middle class over the last 20 years. And they wanted to create the knowledge economy, which is a service space, which is what we do on the state side and many of the Western democracy does. And then the third, they wanted to still control the manufacturing by divesting out of China, but then controlling the nodes of supply chain by building the factory capacities into the ASEAN countries, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Europe. So that aspiration was very much sort of planted and started out in 2014, really started to solidify. So if we look at it, the influence and confluence of these different topics, public policy was a center of supply chain conversation, right? It never took politicians this much energy to talk about supply chain like they did over the last 5 years. And then we found ourselves into COVID-19, right? So world has never realized that how we had, as a civilization, we had become so supply chain centric, right? So if you think about COVID-19 disruption, it disrupted the entire global supply chain, right? There was not a community, country, region, continent that was discriminated and left alone. We found the disruption of a degree that we have never seen before, right? So this prompted the conversation at the highest level of government across the world about how did we allow ourselves to get here? And that started the concept of what I call decoupling. Next slide. So I want to establish that because there is a tremendous sentiment in some part of the world that people misuse this term decoupling, what I'm calling, into deglobalization. And I want to be very, very clear that under no circumstances, I think the humanity can turn the page back and build a fort around the borders and says, you know what, I no longer want to cross-border trade. I will source, manufacture, build, distribute, and consume everything locally. That simply will not occur, can never occur. The reason is there's a tremendous interconnectivity we have with each other. The market potentials. You look at some of the largest emerging markets that are coming up, but there's no way we can avoid not being participatory members of those communities. The Western democracies simply cannot ignore those opportunities in emerging market. In fact, I would propose that the growth that we will see for the US company, and for that matter, the multinational companies from the West, would come from this emerging market. So these conundrums that we're living in, how do we continue to participate and partake in a globalization? And how do we decouple? And my single answer is, well, this is not as difficult as what we would call that can you chew the gum and walk at the same time? And answer is yes, right? And to me, decoupling and globalization can coexist. And there is it's a mindset, it's a paradigm shift, and I strongly believe that it will be accomplished. At a different rate, of course, in a different part of the world, and by the different, obviously, the acceptance rate by the companies, but those successful companies will find itself by building the clusters of their supply chain networks in a very resilient way in a decoupled network.
So I completely agree with you that decoupling is not deglobalization, right? And globalization is here to stay. I would also like your opinion on the fact that globalization has been there forever, right? Meaning you had Chinese goods go through the Silk Road all the way to Europe, thousands of years ago. And China recently started what is called the Belt Road Initiative, which is basically reestablishing that Silk Route, right? And so my question to you is are these policymakers too polarized at this point in time to be able to see that decoupling versus deglobalization are two different things? And we have to, because you have people very polarized talking about local, 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 everywhere you go, eat local, try to source local and all of that. You have a lot of push for local, right? And but at the same time, we have always been a global economy, and I think we will continue to be a global economy. That's in the best interest of all humanity, right? So my question to you is that what is it going to take for the policymakers to kind of distinguish between the two, deglobalization and decoupling, and actually push for decoupling?
So I think Arun, what we're likely to see is there will be a little bit more structured guidance from the policymaker. So, for example, we have already seen in this new administrations in their executive order issues for supply chain review on a 30-day and then the 1-year review it's a very methodical approach of reviewing each of the sector. There's 6 key industries. Semiconductor, for example, is the biggest one, right? Telecommunication being another one, is to under what circumstances that certain industry that policy makers will create a guidance and have a little bit more influence on the companies to say what they would consider as a national security. Meaning if you are going to build certain things and you do not have your supply chain network decoupled and resilience is not shown and proven, they may actually take that as an issue and may actually prohibit or restrict some of the things that we have been able to do it over the last 25, 30 years. So what you're likely to see is the guidance coming from the policymaker in a very structured way to have companies, so we're not going to allow you to have the market share unless you prove that your supply chain is A, decouple, and B, as a resiliency built into it, so we can ensure and assure that there is a security measures in place. Good point in case you look at the Intel yesterday just announced they will invest $20 billion in building plants in the state of Arizona, right? This is what I call the chipset manufacturing, the fab manufacturing's coming home. That's an easy example that you can start to see that companies are going to have to think about it. How do we become proactive, and how do we, especially the advanced manufacturing that is driven by heavy capital intense, capex intense projects, how do we decouple? So that doesn't mean that Intel has to make every chip here. Intel can have an Asia market, Intel can have market in North America, Intel can have Africa market, and so there might be this cluster mode, the coupling mode, the logistics clusters would have to be looked at it from a customer centricity, but driven off of the public policy guidance.
Okay. So with that, I'll move to the next slide. You can talk about decoupling a little more.
Yeah, so I think, question might be, right? I mean, so what is it, but Nick, what is a decouple? I mean, how do you go from what we have called over the last 30 years, the corporate organization have been used to cheaper, better, faster. And, we have gotten to this long linear joint supply chain. Why not just after COVID is over, we just go back to our old ways of doing? Again, that linear supply chain can no longer be afforded. There is a policy requirement that's going to be enforced. Free trade agreements will have a very structured guidelines that we are already seeing under the new administration here. The European Union is taking a look at it. India subcontinent, Indian government is looking at it. ASEAN countries are looking at it. So there's a bilateral and multinational trades are under the process right now to look at these opportunities. So you have a policy pressure, you have a free trade agreement being renegotiated, and last but not the least, you have a stakeholder and shareholders that they're going to demand that we're no longer going to allow companies to walk away blaming some pandemic or some geopolitical issues and say, we didn't realize we were not prepared for this kind of an issue. So there will be a higher demand from each of these key stakeholder group, in my view, that will force the C-suite to take a look at the supply chain network and say, how do I go from the linear to this web, the clusters, and then the web? So they're still independent in a way, but interdependent in some ways, but connectivity as such that it has a lot more resiliencies than what we did over the last 30 years.
So in your mind, Dr. Vyas, what do you think, I mean, if, for example, if I'm a company that was impacted by the pandemic, my supply chain was disrupted, what should I have learned? And how do I actually look at that from a overall preparedness for my next pandemic?
Yeah, so Lauren, one of the biggest thing I think the leadership, and we're going to go to the framework that I think the leadership needs to adopt to it, but I would certainly propose that the leadership needs to have a paradigm break, not paradigm shift, paradigm break, meaning you have to crush your thinking of 30 years, that total cost of ownership is not always the cheapest, better, faster. That mindset has led you to this linear, one country-centric supply chain network. That was always risk, right? It was a risky proposition. We just were dodging the bullets. So forget about the pandemic, but this will not be the last pandemic we will face as a humanity. But think about just the geopolitical issues, which we see this on the horizons, right? I mean, there's a constant threat and issues being built up in Indo-Pacific, China and US. And so you have to think about these things, not afterthought, but as your strategic blueprint, and think about how do we create the customer-centric supply chain nodes that provides a much more optimal ways to cater that market, right? And this is not one of the things we're going to talk about it, why digital transformation is underpinned by this, my conversation, the decoupling overarched by digital transformation, overarched by having a huge data-driven insight. If you build this correctly, I think you can set yourself up for next decades to be much more agile, much more flexible, and in fact, very much in a winning front of your market share.
Yeah, I agree. And so, and in your, if I were to paraphrase it, you have to invest more and your costs are going to go up, right? I mean, in terms of everybody in the short term, your costs are going to go up and you are always looking for the cheapest source until now, and that's no longer going to allow you to survive in the long run, right? So
that is correct. So the equation of total cost of ownership, the TCOs, has to be looked at a little differently. Because you know what? If we really take the cost of disruption and you factor that cost in over less than 30 years, right? But you invest those costs as a cost of avoidance, all of a sudden you can make the case that this is not the cost, it's not costing me more, but in a long run, it's giving me the resilient supply chain that I can count and bank on, that I'm much more customer centric, I am much more socially responsible, my carbon footprint is much lower than it would be in a longer strain, and I am less likely to be disrupted by a variety of factors that I would be predisposed to in a linear, long, single string supply chain.
thank you. Right.
Yeah, so I think, Arun, to carry on to your thing, how do, as a leader of the company, look at it? And I think one of the elements, my colleague from Steptoe and I sort of thought through this as it's sort of an optimal framework, right? And so it's a multidimensional. So you as a company, and this is probably more applicable to mid-sized to the large company, but even smaller company can no longer use the excuse of their size and not think through this framework. And so we'll touch on this quickly, but optimal stands for operational, technical, infrastructure, management, advocacy, and legal. Because all of a sudden, it's easier said to decouple out of something and go to somewhere else. And it's not a decision of flipping a switch on and off. And so we'll touch through this, how one can think through this holistically and make those decisions in a much more sound way. So let's get on to the first dimension of this. So operational, this is huge, right? And again, I did this presentation to my colleagues in Asia and Europe. So if you see the spellings as a British, is still kept that for that audience. So if you think about operational, let's make sure that you think about when you decouple, where you planting your next move. You got to think about the human capital. You got to look at it, make sure that operational framework of that particular location that you're going to go in allows you to provide some of this capability, right? So supplier ecosystems, innovation centers, availability of the skilled workforce, business-friendly regulatory policy, right? So there is a standard checklist. One has to go through it. But you can also try to then understand that if I build this next generation supply chain network, how much that is going to help me reduce my carbon footprint, as I spoke earlier, the agility and resiliency, the quality, the product reliability, right, and repeatability. Each of these things can be then looked at it from the operational standpoint. So basically, in this particular framework, and we have a very detailed execution plan that goes through this, but what I would really look for in this area is how do I strike the balance of manufacturing, planning, and supply chain adaptability with a very sound resiliency-backed process in my next node, whatever that is. If I'm moving out of China into Cambodia or India subcontinent or Mexico, I would actually think through my operational capability from that. Next. Technical, what do we mean by this? Right? So we have to have This can no longer be that we're going to move, shut the plant in one place and open up. No, I need to start to think about how do I use some of the technical capabilities and integrate those into my new generation supply chain network design. That includes the AI, the ML, the blockchain, the data analytics capabilities. Because if you're going to decouple, recommendation is you might as well adapt to an advanced framework of technical capabilities than staying with the legacy. So think from that standpoint, how one can actually sort of understand that and make that as an integral part of your design strategy, right? So conceptualize, analyze, appropriately implement the supply chain centric, the customer centric network design. So I would actually do very deep analytics and create my customer density analysis, and then build my node close to that, and design entire supply chain node logistics cluster to cater to that particular customer centric node. So imagine I may have a 6, 7, 8, depends on what your market is, which vertical you represent, and how many countries you can actually do this. But this will certainly be a very good way to look at it.
Going to infrastructure?
So we talked about operational, technical, but one has to be very cognizant. The infrastructure is a huge enabler. So you want to look at your next move of where to decouple to from these lenses. You want to make sure that that country and its government has a plan in place to really focus on infrastructure, because you certainly don't want to go to the place where you will be challenged with some of the key resources. So when we talk about the infrastructure, it's the soft infrastructure, hard infrastructure. One has to look at it, make sure there is access to the power, water, roads, regulatory. Each of these things in infrastructures, one has to sort of go through this. And this is a very detailed analysis. The large company has internal resources to do that. So if you're a small to mid-sized company, you may want to look to seek help to make sure that somebody is actually vetting your particular supply chain strategy through these lenses, and make sure that you make the right decision and a sound decision. That doesn't mean that you should not look at those areas of opportunities. They might be in a second tier or third tier in this space, but just make sure you have a long-term view of understanding the risk and rewards.
So on this one, if I may ask a kind of digress back to from last webinar, when you talked about the trade war with China, right? And you also talked about China having built a lot of this infrastructure within its country and also globally. And so the question is US now on the path to building that infrastructure? Has the US done enough to build that infrastructure? Do companies, let's say I'm a company operating out of the United States, do I have access to the infrastructure? For example, even today, I don't think 5G is fully available, right? So those are going to be some of the limitations in terms of public policy influencing what infrastructure the US companies have in order to do this, right?
Absolutely, Arun. So I think what we see on the horizon under this administration, the Biden administration, is a very strong desire to really focus on this lens. So there is a plan that's already been mobilized called a $3 trillion infrastructure plan that's going to focus on each of these assets that I've spoke about it. Coincidentally, this is something we wrote a while back before the Biden administration's published this initial view on it, but it talks about investments in human capital, roads, bridges, technology, infrastructure, and both the hard and the soft infrastructure, human capital. And truly $3 trillion, I think it's a long overdue for our country here, because we have spoke about this since 80s during the election cycle and administration comes in. This is on both sides of the political spectrum. No one has done enough to really focus on these things. And I hope that under the new plan that's been proposed, that we finally move forward with this. Because if we think about what China has been able to accomplish, that success in the shortest period of time in the human history was underpinned by its ability to build a massive infrastructure through its tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 cities, connecting them via rail, intermodal, airports. And by the way, if you just go outside of that, take that old Silk Road concept into the Belt and Road, they now span that across, building the physical infrastructure on the One Belt, One Road, and now they're focusing on the digital infrastructure on the One Belt, One Road. So that is truly is going to be the key for this framework, is the local government working together and supporting driving this infrastructure. So we talked about these things, right? This is all external things that I'm mentioning. But honestly, the leadership and management has to be bold. If you are inundated in your C-suite with the guys that they want to do marginal process improvement and feel comfortable playing in a sandbox that you designed 15, 20, 30 years ago, I don't think this will take you too far. So the management has to have a deliberate decision to focus on supply chain resilience and agility. They have to have a fortitude to adopt the digital transformation, right? It is no longer an option. I am venture to say here on the record to say, if you don't transform and your leadership does not have a fortitude and aptitude to transform, you will be a data point in the history by 2025, if not sooner. So in order for you to compete, you really have to use this as a lesson, learn from it, and adapt and become resilient. So what is a large company? They're so good at it, right? Well, they're good at building the advocacy. I mean, you look at it, and I know we use this term in the US called the lobbyist, and we think that is a bad word, that meaning that's a wrong way to look at the influence on something. And the answer is no. Advocacy for businesses is good. It has a direct confluence and influence on the public policy. So be part of this advocacy in which you're emphasizing that customer-centric local node, buying local, promoting specific brand as a best in class, health and safety, the quality, sustainability. These are all part of what I call the advocacy efforts that one has to try to take advantage of it. And this may be very different by regions. So you may have to tailor. If you're a multinational company and you have 7 global nodes of your supply chain, each node may have a different advocacy, but you have to be, this has to be in your forefront, right? Think about how to creatively and prioritize this interest through the lenses of advocacy. And you may not have to do this alone, but do it in a group, coalition of the same folks in your industry. Build the momentum to promote and align what you're trying to do within your 4 walls to the public policy and be engaged. So it's no longer that you have a $100 million operation, you're going to sit behind your 4 walls and try to drum up what you want to do as a transformation initiative. Engage local government, public policy, create an influence, be part of the coalitions, and drive that advocacy efforts forward, because that's very important in a decoupled supply chain. And last but not the least is the legal. Remember, as we decouple, you're no longer dealing with the one place where you're sourcing, one place you're manufacturing, one place you're consolidating, one place you're shipping from and to. So your tax liabilities, your customs and border regulations, your regional evaluation, each of these things can play a huge role. So make sure you actually partner with the legal expertise in each of these regional supply chain nodes to make sure and ensure that you're fully compliant. So you almost have to think about each of this web of nodes that I'm talking about in a decoupled state. You have to create your core competency of understanding, because if you are building your node, let's say in India subcontinent, that framework of policy may be very different than in ASEAN or the China or USMCA if you were to go into Mexico. And you would have to have an expertise on this. So make sure you think that's from those standpoints and create the expertise. If you don't have internal, make sure you align with somebody who provides you this and keeps an eye out for you to give you the directional sense on a proactive basis to make sure your processes, your systems, your strategy, all are aligned to that particular node to be in compliance.
So that was a great explanation of optimal. Thank you, a nice term actually, very nicely coined. So, so from a standpoint of, you mentioned specifically, I'd like to talk about more in the legal aspect of it, right? With a lot of the policies differing so much, and the fact that policies change, public policies. I mean, there are people putting in tariffs, putting in incentives for you to come and start your node in a particular subcontinent or in a particular region, right? How is it going to be possible? I mean, is there another knowledge repository that needs to start, which allows somebody to understand the legal ramifications? Because the key is, yeah, if you're a US company and trying to work globally, it's going to be very difficult for you to keep up with all these changes at all points in time, right? And the costs of keeping up with the changes also is a big factor in that standpoint.
No, absolutely, Arun. So to answer your question, I think one has to let's take a pulse check. Is the decouple is a little bit more complex than the linear supply chain we're used to? And answer is yes, right? Because you would have to now learn doing business 6 different ways rather than just a one way. But it's not impossible. This is not a new concept if we think about it. Japanese auto manufacturer, when they took a strong market share, each of them, so let's talk about just the Toyota, for example. Toyota realized that they have a global market share, that they were taking foothold on it. So what did they do? They decoupled their manufacturing. They were no longer manufacturing everything in Japan. Rather, they started to build a manufacturing plant close to where the customer demand was. And how did they do that? Well, they literally follow the optimal framework that I'm referring to in somewhat, right? And so you look at their Latin American manufacturing capacity. You look at in Asia, they have 4 different nodes within Asia. In North America, in US, they have nodes, right? So large manufacturers have done that. It's very soundly they're manufactured. Now, some component are still manufactured some ways, right? And then shipped to these different nodes. So one can start to think that model and say, how do we deal with that complexity? And how do we sort of create a standard operating procedures for each of this region and make sure that we have core competencies in each of the lenses that we talked about. And I don't think it's that complex. And you don't necessarily, if you're small to mid-sized company, I would urge that you don't always have to think about building these things as your own core competency. They're a service provider. Or when you're in the field of doing digital transformation, helping companies. So if I don't have it in-house, I would partner with somebody like you. So you have to really think about how you use the intermediary in each of these different disciplines that I've gone through and partner with them to make sure that you have a foresight, insight, and your fingers on the pulses to drive your business in a much more global way, but in a very resilient way.
Yeah, I completely agree. Thank you for that. Yeah. Now, going to a lot of people who are more in the companies where they have supply chains, question would be, am I digitized enough, right? Is there something called digitized enough? Is there a benchmark? Is there something that they can actually see to say, this is where I need to be in order to be able to operate in this post-pandemic world? What would that benchmark be? How would you arrive as a company at what that benchmark is? Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? So I think it's a very simple 3-question inventory one can take. And my first question would be, do you have a real-time data analytics capability for your supplier? Supplier, and I'm talking about not only tier 1, but tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4. If I were to ask your C-suite, and I come and say, give me your supplier performance ratings for each of these tiers, and if it takes you more than 10 minutes to run the report, then you're not digitized. Second, you're manufacturing through your customer last mile delivery. Do you have the data sets and the visibility of your dashboard that gives you a very in-depth level the view of your performances? And again, I'm not talking about once a quarter, once a month, while you have 15, 20 people trying to augment a bunch of spreadsheets and patching the data together. I am talking about a dynamic insight into your data sets. And if answer is no, then you're not digitized. And then my last point would be your customer segmentation. Do you have your demand side? And are you using all the capabilities for your customer market segmentation and using it to gain the market share? And if answer is no, you're not digitized. So this is no longer, we're not talking about going away from 15 different versions of spreadsheet into the one consolidated and collated spreadsheet. We're past that. That's a 1999 concept. We're talking about the digitization. It's what the capabilities are. Because if you're not doing it, I promise to you, your competition is doing it, and they're taking the market share from you every day.
Okay, thank you. I think, yeah, that would be very helpful for every company to ask those 3 questions. It's very well put as 3 questions that they can ask themselves. We do have one more question. Does the free market reconfigure the supply chain, or does the government policies reconfigure the supply chain? Which one are you recommending? Like, reconfigures the supply chain? Where should be the thrust?
Yeah. So Arun, can you repeat the question? I lost the first part.
So the question is, should the free market reconfigure the supply chain, or should government policies reconfigure the supply chain?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So I'm a big free market capitalist, but if you allow companies to strictly stay in a status quo mindset of 30 years ago, right, for the last 30 years rather, that we have practiced, which is a free market, profit-based decisions, we'll find ourselves back into the pandemic of COVID-19. Because let's face it, government ends up bailing out most of these failures. We've pumped $4.3 trillion. So next disaster occurs, we pumped another $5 trillion to bail out everybody. Imagine how many times do we have to do this? So what I think the right way to do this, have the free market, but have the guidance in a structured way so that the country's national security, first and foremost, is not compromised. B, that the livelihood of its citizenry is not compromised. So if you're in the business of pharmaceutical, if you're in the business of food producing, and if you're going to put 340 million people in our country at the risk of starvation. I may have a very strong guidance for you to make sure that your food supply chain has some resiliency built in so we don't create a disaster on hand, right? So I think there is a sort of a blended approach here that we're going to have to be open to, which is the free market ultimately letting the company decide how to do it, but giving them the direction what to do it. So Intel is a perfect example that if you're going to build chipsets and you're going to be heavily reliant on Southeast Asia, and we're going to use those in the telecommunications, defense equipment, and satellites, we will hold you for those, especially the federal contracts and those areas, that you build some capabilities of those things locally so that there's a resiliency that supports the national security and the resiliency that we would look for. So it's a combination of those two things that I think we're going to have to start to look at it.
I would agree, because a lot of times, if you let it just on free market, they'll probably go fastest, cheapest route, because they're looking at trying to improve their shareholder value, not looking at resilience in the long run, because a lot of the companies are more focused on how their stock price is doing, right? And so that's a problem. There's another question on the fact that you talked about investing for the optimization, right? And I think the question is, how should the TCO model of optimization include the cost of risk in a quantitative way? Meaning, how do you quantify that cost of risk? You talked about it as saying over 30 years, if I look at my resilience, I'm good. But how do you actually quantify?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think there's obviously there's a strong framework of calculating your ROI, return on investments, right? So we have models. They look at each of these things and does very thorough analysis in terms of what each of those assets that you would actually have to invest in, and how do you depreciate, and what kind of a risk factor you would use it, and how do you model those things. And an aggregate of those parameters would give you an overall risk factor, right? And so this is a very standard approach of risk assessment on your investment portfolio that you would go through. And there is a well-documented use cases that companies go through. But ultimately, even though you can model a lot of the inherent risk, look what happened in Myanmar. In 2012, we had a democracy introduced. A lot of apparel manufacturing came in and built their base. And 2 months ago, we saw the military coup taking over the country, right? And we see H&M, for example, Mango, found themselves. And I promise to you that they did exactly a few things that I've spoke about it, but you may find. So there is inherent risk that one has to look at it, but those will be factored in. So if I were to build that model for Myanmar, my scaling rate, 1 to 10, and stability of government would have never been more than 5 to 6, because the country has a history of military interferences. So you have to get sort of at that level of historical and macro data to build those factors in. But at the same time, if you look at it, the cost is a $60 on an annual monthly wage rate. Then you go to Cambodia, 72, Vietnam, 80, China, 150. So even if I ran that model for 4 or 5 years, I may have created enough savings to offset the temporary blip on the radar screen. So we have different ways of modeling this kind of a risk assessments and risk portfolio as we build this out.
Okay. So another question, going back into your term decoupling, right? And I'll ask the question, over the last 20 years, we have noticed the evolution of regional economies of North America, Europe, Asia, right? So there's regional economies, etc. What then is the misleading term of decoupling?
Yeah, so I think it's not a misleading term. Basically, even though we had a regional economies, our supply chain were never decouple. It was always a one country centric. So it was all the raw material was aggregated in China. All the manufacturing capacity was done that. All the consolidation was there and was then shipped to each of this region and regional economy. So we became very comfortable about being dependent on a single country to supply the world's hunger and appetite for cheaper, better, faster goods. Guess what? For 3 decades, that's what we use and throw it away. So a mindset, because China was very successful in building its infrastructure to provide the world's appetite with a constant demand. But then China also started to feel some upward pressure, wage being a big one, sustainability being the second one. They no longer wanted to pollute and use up the resources for the cheap manufacturing. So those pressures internally was also heading up to them. They wanted to diversify their economy, not just on manufacturing, but into the knowledge economy and consumption-based economy. So all of these things factored into it. So now, how do you create those and support the supply chain nodes for those regional economy? And that's what I am linking, that each region should have its own independent network interconnected with other regions, but still supporting each of the regional demand.
Thank you. Yeah. So thank you. So one last question from me. We are almost out of time. So Myanmar, you mentioned earlier, has now become a military regime. I think a lot of it was with support of China. So are we going to, with China under a lot of pressure where people are decoupling and looking for alternate sources, obviously the Chinese economy is going to get impacted. Are we going to see a more aggressive China?
I think we will see China as what we have seen China. China is diversified, strong, knows its capabilities and power, and will actually flex the muscles, whether or not we as a US likes it, or EU, or for that matter, anybody else in the region. And we've seen that they rightfully now claim and will actually be the largest economy by 2030. So I believe this is a question that is being asked by the Western democracies and large democracies across the world. And we will continue to see, and why my hypothesis of decoupling will even further be supported is because some geopolitical tensions that can arise if you don't decouple. And then you'll find yourself in a place where you will have no way to react in time or circumvent and mitigate some of the situation that you might be dealt with.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So it's not only from a pandemic standpoint, but also from a national security standpoint that we need to start learning to decouple. So, yeah.
That's correct.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Vyas, and thank you everybody for attending. If you have any last comment, you can go ahead, Dr. Vyas. If not, thank you very much.